Hi, this is Allison Law, host of the Literary Atlanta podcast. We took a break. That black, cavernous hole in your life, it was us, taking a silent retreat of sorts. And when I say we and us, I really mean I took a break. I'll go a bit more into the proper pronouns in a minute, but yeah, I know it's been quiet here. When I released the last episode, episode 42, featuring my interview with Hank Klibanoff of the Buried Truths podcast, I had already started telling people in the background that I wasn't booking new interviews. I had a few in the can, as we say, and I was going to get those out and then make a public announcement, tell you one-to-one that Literary Atlanta was taking a well-deserved break between seasons 1 and 2. And then I just couldn't get myself to follow through with that plan. I still have those interviews in the can, and I have still been recording many interviews in the almost 7 weeks that we've been on hiatus. So I have a treasure trove of backlogged material that I'm going to be sharing with you. But first, I want to acknowledge that this first episode of season 2 is coming out on the 1-year anniversary of the Literary Atlanta podcast debut. It was on this Thursday in August 2017 that we went live with episode 1 of season 1, featuring guest 1, Darren Wong. I was fortunate at that time to be part of a full team. Literary Atlanta was one of 4 podcasts being piloted by a professional production company called 0 Mile Media. I had an executive producer and co-founder of 0 Mile named David Markowitz, who was based in New York, and a journalist and public radio producer, Sean Powers, who's based here in Atlanta. And the 3 of us planned and scheduled and recorded and edited and published and promoted everything together. And we had a really good long run, probably through the end of January, early February. And that's when David moved on and Sean started wrapping things up as a producer so that he could become director of a newly created podcasting department at Georgia Public Broadcasting. So when I say we, it's really just been me for a little while. And I've been doing all of the things that David, Sean, and I were doing as a team. And that's why it was time for a break. And I'm trying to be positive about it because it's really a positive thing. It's a great thing for all 3 of us who were involved in the very beginning of the Literary Atlanta podcast. But I'm also, as I read this, I realize I'm a little bit sad. And, it's also not to make you think that there's anything wrong or anything that's changing other than we have a lot of crazy good content that we're going to bring you. It was just time to recalibrate, to re-energize, and to record. I have so many interviews for you, and I can't wait to introduce you to this season's first guest. She's a feminist historian who has made it her mission to recover the incredible lives and stories of the women of India. My conversation with Ruby Lal about her latest book, Empress, is straight ahead on episode 43 of Literary Atlanta. Atlanta is a book town, home to avid readers and host to some of the finest writers and storytellers on the planet. That's my thesis statement, and this podcast provides the supporting details through behind-the-scenes anecdotes, author interviews, and all of the ways that you can experience the rich literary landscape right here in Literary Atlanta. Ruby Lal is professor of South Asian Studies at Emory University. She holds a doctorate in modern history from the University of Oxford in England and master's and doctorate degrees in history from the University of Delhi, India. Before coming to Emory about 13 years ago, Ruby taught history and anthropology at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where she also served as associate director of the Program for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality. Her fields of study include feminist history and theory and the question of archive as it relates to writing about Islamic societies in the pre-colonial and colonial world. Speaking of that pre-colonial world, did you know that 4 centuries ago, a Muslim woman, a 34-year-old widow named Jahan, ruled an empire? She was the 20th and favorite wife of the Emperor Jahangir, an astute politician, a talented dress designer, a very accurate marksman, an innovative architect whose work inspired her stepson's Taj Mahal. Noor Jahan was the only woman to acquire the stature of Empress in her male-dominated world, and that's also the title of Ruby's book, Empress. So, to learn more about the astounding life of Noor Jahan, I asked Ruby when she first learned about the woman and the legend. While Noor Jahan is new to me, and I presume is probably new to a lot of Americans, she's really a household name in South Asia.
That's right.
Will you talk about how you first discovered Noor Jahan?
I met her, as I write in the book, as a little girl, as part of this storytelling afternoons I used to have with my mother. Now, my mother had told us stories forever, and all sorts of stories, historical, mythical, romance, allegorical, and there were always women at the center of the stories that she used to tell. I mean, those were my best I guess, loving moments with my mother. So one of these afternoons, and I guess I was 8 or 9, late in the afternoon, she was oiling my hair and she was telling me a story. And then a little later on, we began playing what is like an American game of jacks.
Okay.
And the story was continuing. And I got bored with whatever that story was. I cannot recall at all what she was telling me about. But I said to her that I'm bored. I want a new story. And, this I remember clearly. And my mother has affirmed that this is what...
That's the thing that's amazing to me, is that you do have such clarity around this moment.
Yes. So it must have, I think the subconscious is a really... interesting phenomena. It has sediments, I think, that stayed with me. So anyway, she told me the story of this great queen whom she called Queen of Queens, that is Maharani in Hindi, and it just stayed with me. Exactly the details of her rendering, of course, I can't tell you, but I do know that I was besotted. And when the story was done, my father would always sit around us, and he'd be hidden behind his newspapers, but he would always be spying on the mother-daughter transaction. I think he was spying, I don't know. But I remember I turned around and I said, I am Noor Jahan. So he looked at me and I said, and you are Jahangir. So he laughed. Mm-hmm. But anyway, that was that afternoon. But somehow, clearly, the moment stuck in my mind. And, I loved stories, that's absolutely clear. And then I had, of course, stupendous history teachers in school and then college. I went on to become a historian and a historian of Mughal India. And my first book was on the incredible women in Mughal history. The imagination around that world of Mughal women. And so that's a book just before Noor Jahan, was that, and this is in history writing, but also in a general sense, that the only thing we know about women is their attachment with this space called harem. And this idea of harem, which was nothing in the popular imagination, also of the historians included, was nothing but this kind of sexualized space, right, in which women are almost innate figures, non-existent except for the pleasure of the monarch. So I decided to write against that, and I chanced upon a very beautiful memoir of a Mughal princess who was the daughter of the first king.
And this is Princess Rosebody?
Exactly.
Okay.
Princess Gulbadan, who in her older years leads a women's pilgrimage to Mecca, which is a very bold and domineering, in a good sense of the term, task to do.
Definitely.
Right? And then my first book stops at that point, virtually literally, when she goes to the Hajj. But the question was, what would I do for a second book? The more I thought about it and read, the more I realized that we have these amazing histories that, for very good reason actually, talk about the victimized Indian woman. And the more I thought about it, the more troubled I felt.
Why did you feel troubled?
Because I thought that, is this all there is to Indian women? Right? Yes, there are sources that do all this. But my work and my study was saying that no, this is not all there is to it. Furthermore, the more I read, I realized that we have no social history of the girl child. That figure does not exist in our histories. So that became my second book. And I wrote against pictures of victimhood by talking about the playfulness of the girl. And by that, I don't mean games and sports. But by that, I mean how, no matter what the circumstances are, how Indian girls and women over time have been exemplary in thinking about their lives, in dealing with everyday issues. So they may not be leading revolutions, but they are thinking individuals, right? That was the book in some senses, thinking about who this girl child is. How do we think about her? How do we write her into history? And as I was finishing this book, I got an email from a lovely editor in India who was heading Penguin Press at that time. 2-liners. I had met her at a party, and she wrote saying, "Ruby, there is no critical biography of Noor Jahan. I believe you're the person to do it. Will you do it?" And Alison, I started kicking myself in the back because I thought, this is something I should have thought about, right? So I'm excited, I'm thinking about all this.
But that was part of your centering process. You shouldn't kick yourself.
Well, that's very kind of you. And that's exactly what a friend of mine said to me. She said, Ruby, sometimes it is not the authors who choose their subjects. It is the subjects who choose the authors. And, that's really where the story of Noor Jahan began for me.
So how long did it take you to write this book, to research and write this book?
I'll take a few moments to talk about the evidence because, that was really the first part of thinking about the book, and this is my long-standing intellectual quest, but it also really relates to how this book came to be what it is, but also really, I think it is the question around why amazing women, even today, get lost out of history. One of the important things I had centered in this first book was I had taken on board a really very important question that was not just posed to me, but is posed to almost all feminist scholars. This one senior male historian said to me in Delhi, when I began research on this first book, he said, well, how are you going to do this? There are no sources for it. And this is a question that's, always put to us. There is a sense of disbelief around women and women's power, I think. And there was Gul Badan, right? Princess Rose Body, this incredible memoir that was, not only did people not know about this, but also it had been translated in 1902. But it had been put on the periphery by calling it a soft society of women. That's what it shows.
Huh. Okay.
So I took that on board, and it completely turned the picture upside down. So anyhow, my method became an important one, but it's one also that I've thought and reworked and looked at the question of what we call in academic terms, but it's fairly clear how we approach the question of evidence, what constitutes the ground of history writing, these things. Now, in her case, there's something really quite extraordinary that I knew right from the start, because not only in household legends by tour guides, but also in some early academic writing around Noor Jahan, this is something you see in print and in conversations. People say things like, she issued coins, she issued imperial orders, there are paintings of her. There is a bullet point giving, if you will, but not really a concreteness to what it means to say she issued orders. So let me give you an example.
Okay.
These orders survive, right? These imperial orders survive, at least 10 of them in archives in Western India. I looked at these orders, and the language of the orders was extraordinary. I had to look carefully to see what was she giving orders about? Some of the orders were the same as what a king would do, such as, protecting peasant rights, such as protecting land rights of people, which is, so before her, 2 other women in the harem had issued orders, but they were really essentially complementing or enhancing what their sons had done.
Yes.
Not independent ordering, if you will, right? The more striking thing for me was that the imperial seal that she uses, it's called Noor Jahan Padshah Begum. Padshah meaning the emperor. Begum is an honorific, right? So the language, going to the language and the detail brings a concreteness to what was happening around her. Likewise, coins. It's okay to say that, yes, coins are being issued, but we have to remind ourselves that these are technical signs of Islamic sovereignty, such as coins, such as issuing orders, right? This means something is happening. Then people, so these are early conversations I'm reporting with some scholars. People say, oh, but he only mentions her hunting feats. So you look at the hunting feats, you see that she is killing tigers. Then you begin to think about, why is she killing tigers? This man is writing, of course, in a flow of thought manner. He's not saying, my wife, the co-sovereign Noor Jahan, is hunting tigers. This is a informal sign of kingship. Only kings were allowed to do this, right? Or when certain officers would say, oh, she sat in the imperial balconies. What was that? Only Akbar the Great, who actually instituted this practice, her father-in-law, taken from the Indic practices, which means essentially viewing the goddesses. That's your or gods. That's what the masses were doing. So pictures began to accumulate around me. Right, she was the first person to be actually portrayed by the great imperial portraiture artist, the great Abul Hassan. My art history colleague at Emory, a very fine Europeanist, Walter Melian, when he looked at this painting with me, he said, Ruby, what's happening here? What is she doing? I said, she's loading the gun. He said, my God, it's amazing. I have never seen any European queen loading the gun. So it was all adding up to an incredible source base. I also wanted to take things such as, because the visual world is really important in this history, that is not only her portraits, but the fact that she was an ingenious architect. She designs the tomb of her parents. It's called the Little Jewel Box on the Yamuna River in Agra. And it is a beautiful marble jewel box. The use of marble inspires her stepson's Taj Mahal. And I had to really understand some of the language of architecture, the language of paintings, for example, and I leaned on to my art history colleagues who were really incredible. It was really like going to art history graduate school.
Right.
It was not looking at paintings as historians do, but it was looking in paintings to see, what is the meaning of these symbols? What happens when somebody raises a gun? What is the significance of holding a falcon in your hand? 2 peacocks suggesting love. Things like that. There's a lot of this language that I had to, which is all great. But so the first few years were really absorption of material of different kinds, but also really rolling up my sleeves and translating Persian things and putting it down, making sense of an architecture, so to speak. After that, it was how to transform those 300 beautiful pages of hardcore material to something that would appeal, that I could carry all these intricacies to wider intellectual audience.
Yeah, I actually, when I was reading through the book, I started reading the book and then I flipped back to your notes because I wanted to hear your approach and what you considered the things that you had to tackle when you were going in to research her. Because she did not have a memoir.
No.
and you didn't have first-person accounts other than those 10 proclamations or orders.
That's right.
And then you had some of her poetry because she was also a talented poet.
That's right. So there's poetry, there's architecture, there's, imperial orders, there are coins, but there is also the court writing, which is supposed to be, at least for the male world, that's the most legitimate form of writing. So not only is her husband recording copiously on her, it is also, so at some point in 1624, he dies in 1627, but he falls ill in 1624, and he asks a courtier, a man called Mutamed Khan, in 1624, who's around them, going in various journeys with them, watching her very closely, to continue his memoir. He continues that, but he also writes a couple of his own documents in which she is recorded non-stop. Then you have Thomas Roe, the ambassador of James I of England, writing about her in quite extraordinary ways. In 1626, when she goes on the battle, which is a really stupendous moment in this history, out in the battle, to save her husband. Who'd been captured by a really disgruntled nobleman. There is a man who's watching her, and he's a poet and has had several official appointments and joins them in various journeys. He writes in the form, it's called a Masnavi, which is a long 100-page poem. He writes a very adulatory account of her actions at this time and what transpires. It's in Persian, and there are a couple of copies of this. One is in the great Aligarh Muslim Library in northern India, and the other is in Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Again, I had to lean on Persian poetry experts to work through the language of this document. It's an incredible document. Things like that. You also have 100 years after her, you have people like, there's a man called a really eccentric quack doctor, an Italian.
This is the
Nicolao Manucci, who spends almost all his life, he reaches India in his 20s, stays there till his late 60s, and he writes this, incredible volume called Storio do Mugor, which is written in French, Italian and Portuguese, and of course translated later on. And he, records her moment of birth. She's born outside as her parents leave from Iran to India, running for a variety of reasons, which also include state persecution and lack of funds. They join a caravan. And her mother is pregnant with her, and she's born outside Kandahar, which is modern-day Afghanistan. And this is one fact, that she was born in 1577, that all histories agree upon.
They all agree on that part. But the stories are very different between the three main sources that you talk about.
Yeah, and Nicolai Manucci. That's right. So it's like a Rashomon, right? It's a palimpsest. It's a story upon story. And so he uses, the point is not literally to say whether this was right or wrong, but how Manucci was making sense of this story, clearly that he was hearing in India in the early 18th century. And the way he makes sense of this story is by comparing Gayaz Beg, Noor's father, like Joseph, leading Mary on a donkey. And this thing gets carried over in many different renditions, including in films. Then we have Khafi Khan, who's an 18th century, courtier, who's read all of these histories in some way or another. And he's the first person to write about Noor's abandonment by her parents on the road. That's so cinematic in its description, that, first they leave her, and then the mother is really upset and she's crying. And so she says to her husband, "No, my heart will break. Please go bring her." So the father goes under the tree where he had left baby Noor, who was called Meherun Nisa at that time, son of women. And he sees that there is a cobra over her that's protecting her. Now that's supposed to be a really good sign of her magnificence and what is to come. And then when the cobra sees the father from a distance, it just goes away. and the father picks up and brings this child back, and they are united. And you have Alexander Dow, a sailor, an employee of the British East India Company, who also kind of plays on these themes. So these themes can be, replicated into the 19th and 20th centuries. They've also become part of the legends at home. Mm-hmm. People talk about her abandonment. People certainly talk about her birth on the road.
I like what you called it, fact adjacent.
Fact adjacent.
It was kind of filtering out from the legend what pieces were, like, we can't argue that we all agree that she was born just outside of Kandahar. And I also think that I like the way that you critically said we have to look at the motives of the people who created these legends. Mm-hmm. That there was a reason that a Catholic would want to turn this into a Jesus story.
Exactly right.
To promote their own agendas and belief systems.
Also, those are only, I think there's the only way in which we can express certain things that we are astounded by is within the terms of the languages we have. Mm-hmm. And by that, I don't mean literal English, Hindi, Persian, but also the motifs in the language, right? Manucci will have been trained and soaked in this imagery that he's using for her birth. But also in Mughal India, this was an imagery that was well known. The Mughal court had witnessed exchanges with the Jesuits, and the life of Jesus had been told many, many times. In fact, under Noor's husband, Jahangir's atelier, Life of Jesus was painted for the first time. It's called Miradul Quds, which is the mirror of holiness, if you will, or mirror of, the axis, the pole that is Jesus. So life stories of Jesus. So it's a very plural, culture. It's a very rich, mixed culture.
That's what I enjoyed learning about too, as well, is the fact that Noor Jahan is Shia Muslim. Is that right?
And I would say culturally Shia.
Culturally Shia, correct. But her husband was Sunni. Is that right?
Jahangir is half Sunni. His mother is Hindu Rajput.
Okay. So this is, and the people who were migrating to this part of India from Persia, just like her parents, were bringing, it really was this confluence of cultures and backgrounds and different, her family was considered aristocratic or well off, but there were certainly all over the place different economic systems that were there, though.
That's right.
It was, I would say, a very diverse culture and a very open and accepting culture at that time.
Exactly.
Not culture, but, it was a space where many different cultures could thrive.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And I think that is, in a way, if there is a politics... Let's say there are two directions in terms of my political ambition in this book.
Okay.
One is about women's leadership, and I assert this repeatedly. I've written about this in the book. I mean, that is really the soul of the book. If we think of the great Mughals of India, there is only one woman Mughal amongst them, and that is Noor Jahan. So now when we think about the great Mughals of India, we think about the great Mughals of India, which are all men, and there is one woman amongst them, that is Noor Jahan. So that is one issue about her leadership. I mean, this is an exquisite sovereign that has been written out of history for all sorts of reasons that, again, I think through in the book. And the second thing is, there is this incredible India in a way. I don't want to romanticize it. I'm not talking about, coexistence is not unfiltered. There are problems in it. But the world that Noor inhabits, in fact, I think pretty much the world of that time, be it Central Asia, be it Iran, be it Hindustan or modern India, this is a pre-nation time. This is a time before very distinct borders, very distinct national identities. And that is what, allows the movement in the ways in which, movement happens the world over. I mean, migration is central to human history. And so, the insistence on categorizations that is happening in the modern world. This book, and I want to suggest that there are many other ways of being, that there are multiple ways of being, that there is a plural India. This is a problem in India at the moment right now. The insistence at showing and, suggesting a domination of Hindu India, right? I mean, the Mughals under the, right-wing regime instructions, the Mughals are being wiped out of history school textbooks. They've been wiped out in 2016 in Maharashtra, for instance, in West Bengal.
Really? Wow.
And so the whole insistence at showing, of course, the argument is a clever one, which is that local histories have not been represented, but in wiping, the suggestion is that they were invaders, that they were eternally battled one another. And yes, there were battles, and yes, there were problems. Yes, there were ferocities of all kinds in much of Indian history. But we have this too, right? And by saying that, I don't want to suggest that this is an add-on. This is not an add-on. This is the history of India, right? That is really a very important point I'd like to make.
Definitely. The other thing I found interesting about Noor Jahan, you talk about the fact that in Europe, you have Elizabeth I, who's about a decade ahead of her, but considered a contemporary. But she was not of royal lineage.
That's
she did
right.
not inherit her title.
That's right.
And she did not marry until she was 34, which was considered middle age at the time. And I also like what you wrote in the book about you are afraid that sometimes the love story between Noor Jahan and Jahangir overshadows the relationship that they had as co-sovereigns. Can you talk more about that and how she really became a formidable leader?
Yeah, that's right. That's a very, very important question. So the thing is, yes, she was not from the royal family, but from an aristocratic background. And her father held very important positions in the court, including being the prime minister by the time she marries Jahangir. I'll add more extraordinary things about her. She marries Jahangir in her 30s, but she's already widowed and mother of a daughter by this time, which is very unusual. So while you have agential, very creative, really stunning matriarchs in the harem, the younger women essentially came for purposes of production of sons. Marriage was important in order to enhance the life of the dynasty. But that's not why she comes to the. Of course, why she comes to the harem has its own political intricacies, which are in the book.
Right.
I won't give out more.
Yeah, no spoilers.
No spoilers. But the rise is a really interesting one. She's the 20th and last wife of the emperor. There are women extraordinaire, other wives. So the question that why did she do it and not others is a really important question. And the short answer is, of course, twofold. One is, and this is what I wanted to chart in the book. So I have these chapters before she comes to the harem, for which, of course, we have, and this I mean literally, there are no sources for it. We don't know what her first marriage was like, although it was a really long marriage. From 1594 to about 1608. There's a girl from it. She goes to Bengal, which is the Wild West of the time. It is the land of the Bengal tiger. Her husband is an employee of the king of the great Mughal. Bengal has just come into the territorial hold of the great Mughals of India. So there's lots of central and provincial tension that's going on. And their story is folded into this provincial and central tension that takes place. It's a very dangerous area and dangerous part of the world at that time. And so my guess is if there is one place where she will have finessed her hunting skills, it'll be there, right?
That makes sense.
Right? And also, right. And also she's alone at this time. And not alone as in the setup is aristocratic, she'll have hundreds of servants and this and that, but she's not, her relatives are all in northern India. We don't know whether her first husband, Kuli, had any relatives at all in India. He came, 7 or 8 years, or actually a decade after her parents came from Iran. So he'll have shared a lot of the machinations of the court. She will have seen firsthand what was going on in Bengal, issues around land rights, around taxation system. And this is the beginning, or this is the making of this woman, right? This is the accumulation of huge amount of incredible wealth of knowledge, quite clearly. In addition to this fantastic upbringing she'll have had with the kind of parents that she had, which is, she'll have learned the great masters, poetry, constraints of life. So all this accumulation, and then she comes into the harem. And then she builds on it. And from here on, without question, there's enterprise. Without question, there's ambition. There must have been chances that helped her. And, not least, the fact that her father is the prime minister. Her brother is a great employee. And if there's something I can take from the legends, clearly Jahangir is besotted with her.
Yes.
And so, okay for her beauty, but there is something more, right, as history shows us. So I think it is a combination of these amazing things, in a way.
Definitely. You consider yourself a feminist historian.
Yes, absolutely. Historian.
Yes.
Into which feminism is deeply folded.
But that's why I wanted to ask the question, what do you consider a feminist historian, and what distinguishes that from just being an historian? Why was it important to you to adopt that title?
Yeah, great question. I think, in much of the Mughal history that I spoke about earlier on when I came into it as a young graduate student, there were only a few clear directions. Stupendous writing, of course. But the only thing that I saw was men at the helm of affairs, right? The kings were great. They led these amazing wars, or they did the following. What were their agrarian policies? What were the economic setup? What happened in relationship to the peasant? As far as women didn't exist in this history, right? This is really like talking about first generation feminism. Mm-hmm. So I had to not only think about the women in the Mughal court, but also really not just insert them into history, but to say, when you think about the domestic, and I'm now talking about my first book, or when you think about women in that space, right, it changes your whole view of history. And let me explain how. When I charted the harem, so for example, the harem of our imagination, that is a walled, incarcerated harem, did not happen till Akbar the Great, which is the third Mughal emperor. These were tent-inhabiting, nomadic aristocrats that were moving from place to place to place, and they had this spectacular lineage of really powerful women around them. But also everything that they were doing, whether it was birthing children, whether it was hunting, it was all a very political act. In other words, the public and private were deeply mixed up, right? It was not secluded and sacred and walled off. They were very much participants. My practices are very distinctly feminist historian. I, look at the evidence. And one example of this is I always go after what other people habitually ignore. And I always go after the small things of history, which is not what my male colleagues take on. So that's a very feminist practice, but this is history.
What would you like people, your readers, to remember or know about Noor Jahan when they finish the book? What do you want them to take away from the book?
That women of India are incredible. They're powerful. They're exquisite in their thinking. And, but that this is precisely the kind of history, and not just in India, that this is the kind of history that's there everywhere. But there are attempts to erase it, not only in her time, in Noor Jahan's time, but also today, as I've been talking about it. Your question just reminds me, I want to go back to your last question. What should people think about? People should think that evidence is not given. It's not taken for granted. We have to question disbelief. We have to look at things. I always again say to my students and to myself, look where you don't habitually look.
For a closer look at Empress, you'll find Ruby Lal in conversation with WABE's Lois Reitzes tonight, Thursday, August the 2nd, at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. The talk begins at 7 p.m. This event is free and open to the public, with book sales managed by Acapella Books. If you miss Ruby tonight, you'll have another opportunity to see her Labor Day weekend at the AJC Decatur Book Festival. We'll be previewing other Decatur Book Festival authors and events in the coming weeks on the Literary Atlanta podcast. In the meantime, there's another event happening tonight, Thursday, August 2nd. Eagle Eye Books welcomes best-selling author Colleen Hoover. She'll be discussing and signing copies of her latest book, All Your Perfects. Please note there's been a change of venue. This event is going to take place at First Christian Church of Decatur. It is a ticketed event, so check out all the specifics at the Eagle Eye Books website. The Georgia Center for the Book will be hosting George Yancey at the Decatur Library Auditorium on August 7th at 7:15. Yancey's book, Backlash, describes the controversy ignited by a New York Times op-ed he wrote entitled Dear White People. Historical fiction writer Susanna Kersley returns to Foxtail Bookshop in Woodstock on Wednesday, August the 8th. She'll be there to talk about her latest novel, Bellwether, beginning at 6:30 p.m. This event is free and open to the public, but you must purchase a copy of Bellwether to enter the signing line. And that's going to do it for this first episode of Season 2 of the Literary Atlanta podcast. I'm Allison Law, your host. Will you please take just a moment to subscribe to the podcast? That means you can go to Apple Podcast, Radio Public, TuneIn, Stitcher, whatever your podcast pusher of choice is. Subscribe and you'll get an automatic download whenever there's a new episode. And while you're there, if you could leave us a 5-star review, that would be terrific and very helpful in getting other lit-curious people to find us. Take care and have a great week. Hope to see you at a book event in Atlanta very soon.